Welcome everyone to our next session, Kyriba Connectivity Network for Oracle Cloud. A couple of quick reminders before we get going. All attendees are going to be placed on mute. Any questions that you have can be submitted via the chat to panelists or the Q&A. And a recording of this session, as well as a copy of the PDF slides, will be available via a digital library following the event. This session is presented by one of our partner TMS solutions, Kyriba. Presenters today, we have Ms. Kirsten Lemke. She is a payments and connectivity specialist with Kyriba. She has more than 30 years of experience in enterprise payment software and connectivity, working for organizations such as Deluxe, Trintech, Bottomline, and FIS. She joined Kyriba in 2019 and works with clients and prospects to implement best practices for bank connectivity, payment, and fraud initiatives. Kirsten has a degree in marketing from the University of Minnesota, Carlson School of Management, and an MBA from the University of St. Thomas. From the Alere side, we have Mr. Logan Wacker joining. He's our SaaS Treasury Practice Lead and has expertise in Kyriba, Oracle Cloud, PeopleSoft G Treasury, and Swift. His primary project focus is on Treasury strategy, organization, process, and systems. Logan is a regular conference presenter and has authored several white papers on a variety of Treasury, risk, and finance-related topics. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Kirsten.
Great, thanks, Jordan. Super excited to be here today with you and Logan. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most complex aspects of an Oracle Cloud migration, the bank connectivity. In addition, we're going to talk about payment formats, and we're also going to talk about real-time fraud detection. Kyriba's 20 years of experience providing bank connectivity as a multi-tenant SaaS solution has given us a very unique position in the marketplace, which we'll talk about. I'm going to share all of that with you, but first I'm going to turn things over to Logan to talk about the challenges with connectivity. Logan?
Great. Thanks, guys. So before Kirsten and team dive into connectivity as a service, or CaaS, and how Kyriba can help expedite an ERP integration and implementation timeline, we first need to talk a little bit about the issue or the problem statement that Kyriba is trying to address with the solution. For those of us on the call that have either helped implement an ERP in our careers or have helped or maybe sponsored an ERP implementation as a key stakeholder from the client side, you all will know that the bank integrations tend to be one of the bigger points of contention in any one implementation. They're oftentimes a source of project overruns, delays, angry status meetings, you name it. But why is this always the case? Why, especially in 2020, are we still having this issue where every client and every install has a requirement around bank integration or integration with other financial institutions or non-banking body requirements? Doesn't it seem kind of crazy to you? I know it absolutely does to me and the Alere team and the Kyriba team that we're still citing bank integration during ERP projects as one of the main risks or main potential drivers of project delays. What we've essentially gotten to, or what I should say, is overall the issue really stems from the fact that integration and format testing is done individually by bank. And so what we're essentially saying is that every time we have a net new or implementation with a net new client, every one of those clients are going to establish secure FTP integration from each one of their unique ERP cloud instances with each one of their banking partners. So what that really means to us is that once we've established that unique secure FTP integration, it then comes down to doing all the file format testing, the establishment of bank reporting, so in the form of BAI, or even a lot of the global payment file testing. And I know Kirsten made some comments, and I know she'll allude to the formats library and so many other things that Kyriba talk about. But what we want to talk about and help illustrate and help kind of maybe resurface some of the pains from previous projects for others is that most of the pain really kind of stems from the payment side of the house. When we get into a project and we have requirements to integrate for bank reporting and for payments, most of that pain comes on the payment side of the house. Each bank that we're integrating with globally and every country that we're integrating with and every payment method has its own unique flavor. We've talked some about standardization, and standardization tends to come up in the form of bank statements when we're talking about these requirements. BAI or Swift MTs or ISO CAMT statements, all of those are standards that banks have adopted over the years that are widely used globally that we really don't have any issues with. But like I said, most of those issues really stem from the payment side of the house. Now, when we talk about that, essentially what we're doing is saying that when we identify clients' payment requirements, we're essentially forced, we being the system integrators like Lear or any other partner that helps implement ERPs across the different vendors that offer them, we as the system integrators are forced to build out all these formatters and all this custom code line and all these unique pieces of functionality within every ERP application instance that fits and meets the needs of every single bank's unique specs across every country, every format, so on and so forth. And so what that essentially means is that you're paying organizations like a Lear to develop something unique that's tailor-made to you as the client, and that's something that we can't then take with us and transfer to another client, or we can't have multiple clients concurrently using the same connection or the same format, so everything is proprietary and owned to that client. All of this essentially lends to a common theme that was first introduced, I should say, yesterday by Seth Marlowe during the keynote presentation, and then was covered in detail by my colleagues Karen and Dayton during the paradigm shift presentation, where we really talked about the lack of standardization that really causes many implementation impediments and many roadblocks across the industry. Now, before we move on, there's two things that I really want to call out that Kirsten did a good job of framing in this slide. And the first one is starting with business users that need flexibility, or I should say, starting with business users that need flexibility. Now, if a business is looking to expand in a new region or acquire a new business, then they likely need to expand their existing bank relationship into that bank or into that country or region, or they're looking for net new banking services locally that can help meet their needs. In either case, it's important to recognize that a customer's ERP or even their TMS solution like Kyriba needs to have the ability to rapidly adapt to changing requirements, to onboard new business, and to not turn into this IT bottleneck that is being called out by Kirsten here. Essentially what we're starting to find, or what we have all found over time, is that if the application cannot adapt to changing business landscapes, if it can't rapidly scale the solution, or it can't really evolve quickly, then that application starts to work against the value proposition of implementing it in the first place. And it really starts to create discord, it starts to create disconnects with customers, it starts to really diminish the value proposition, like I brought up a moment ago, of implementing that tool. So what we really try to aim for, and what Kirsten will go into a lot of detail, I don't want to steal too much of her thunder from her over the next few minutes, is that we're really ultimately trying to adhere and retain the value proposition of implementing a standalone work center, and not only that, but also figuring out a better way to deal with connectivity as a service and start to really address some of these pains that have lingered for many, many, many years within the ERP and TMS space. Now, before we shift gears, one thing that I want to talk about a little bit is the SWIFT certification and documentation piece that gets called out here. I know in my experience, and I'm sure Kirsten can allude to something similar, is that over the years, before connectivity as a service, or maybe even before our time with Kyriba, we were implementing SWIFT for big clients. If you had big payment volume and you had the need, then SWIFT and somebody like Lear and Logan's team would come in and possibly recommend that SWIFT would be the main reason for the main protocol or form of connectivity that you needed to use to implement with your financial institutions globally. Over time, and it doesn't matter whether you use SWIFT AL2 or SWIFT Direct Connect or what your type of SWIFT solution might be, you've gotten to the point over the last few years where SWIFT is saying now you need to go through the SWIFT self-attestation process. And so what that essentially means is that you are going through as an organization and validating that you adhere to all of the protocols and security and checkboxes and training and so on and so forth with SWIFT. What all that essentially means is that this process is extremely brutal, pretty painful for clients to go through, very time and capital intensive. And what it really leads to is potential business disruptions. If you guys are self-supporting SWIFT, that means it's wholly on you to go through this attestation process, to do it in a timely manner. If you choose not to, or maybe you forget about it, or maybe if you're not in the known on those things, that can lead to substantial business disruptions. SWIFT can effectively cut you off from the network until you start doing until you get through the attestation process properly. And what that really does is start to create that business disruption that I talked about. It prevents you from processing financial transactions, and then everything kind of snowballs on you at that point. And where I'm really going with this, and where Kirsten will go with this a little bit more in depth in the next few minutes once I stop rambling on, is that it's getting much easier to start to farm out security and connectivity and all those pieces to the vendors like Kyriba in the world, because it's their job and that's their main business to ensure that connectivity and security is up and running 24/7 for all of their clients. They're not just doing it for the one client in the world, they're doing it for all multiple thousands of them globally, and it's up to them to truly adhere to that process and make sure that it's functioning without any blips to any of their customers. So now if I can get Kirsten to advance to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the desire to modernize and how that can potentially affect project scope. So when we talk about, or when a client is looking to modernize, or when they're starting to look at migrating to the cloud, they are often looking to take advantage of or potentially evaluate some of the new banking technologies that are available at the time. Kind of like what Kirsten calls out in the first bullet. Now, essentially what many clients are doing, and what a firm like Alir will often recommend during these exercises, is let's not just do a lift and shift. Let's not just take everything that you had on-prem, maybe in your PeopleSoft days, and jam it into the cloud, and jam it into Oracle Cloud, or jam it into Kyriba. What we're essentially doing is say, look at what you're doing today, look at what the banks are offering since the last time you implemented, and let's see what's available out there. One of those items, or maybe an example of what's available out there in the electronic payment space, is maybe converting to an ISO 20022 global payment standard globally. I know my colleague and one of my team members, Michael Kapala, talked a little bit about this example this morning, but what we didn't really talk about during that presentation, or what we don't always think about, is that just because we're converting something, at least on the surface, that seems so simple like payments, doesn't mean that we won't see a lot of scope creep in our implementations. And when we talk about scope creep, a lot of the items we're talking about is that when vendors like Oracle provide system integrators like Alir or Kyriba with enough system access, we are essentially forced to say, hey, if you're going to adopt an ISO standard, we have to go out and talk to all these banks that I talked about on the last scope, start to evaluate, or last slide, start to evaluate all of their specifications by country, by bank, by payment format. And what all of these do is start to add variables and volume into the scope of our project that's kind of vague, for the sake of a better term. You know, when we talk about standardization, ISO might be a standard, but every bank has their own flavor, or every bank and country has its own flavor. And what that really does is really start to call, or lend out to the second bullet point that Kirsten calls out, is that it's really difficult to scope. You know, the Kyribas of the world or the Alirs of the world have done payments globally in dozens and dozens and dozens of countries with many dozens of banks, but there's always some kind of nuance along the way, and that nuance could be a potentially very large gotcha along the way at any one implementation. But like what we keep talking about, what I want to keep getting back to is the whole concept or common theme of the lack of standardization is really starting to cause issues with scope and scope creep and underestimation along the way. What that really does is that when we're starting to perform these development activities, they vary or they change a little bit client by client based on the tool set, based on the timeline, based on the banks, based on the countries. And what that really does is create this unpleasant user experience for customers. Like I talked about when I first started presenting today, is that, we are really just trying to avoid the fact that we're still talking about bank integration as a risk in 2020. We find it to be, why are we still talking about it? Why is it still such a problem? But what it really ultimately has done is say that these ERP bank integrations really weren't ever standardized. Since we are doing them by each client, by each bank, it's really created this unenjoyable, it doesn't really leave a good taste in the mouth of many clients for us. And so what Kyriba is really trying to do as a result is create this connectivity as a service product to really deliver a fundamental shift towards how bank integration is evaluated during an ERP project or even during a TMS project, and really try to change the mindset around integration and try to create a positive user experience there, while also doing it cheaply and quickly, which Kirsten will talk about. But as far as what we've talked about from a connectivity standpoint, I don't want to steal too much of Kirsten's thunder. So I think at this point in time, I'll shift it over to you, Kirsten. I believe we're on our first poll question, right?
We are, in fact, on our first poll question. So what we'd like to do is understand where you are on your Oracle Cloud journey. So Jordan, do we get to see that, or do I just see my poll question 1?
Yep, it is up and running right now. So attendees have about 30 seconds here to answer, and we'll go ahead and share the results.
Perfect.
We
Logan, waiting for the results, what do you think the most popular answer is going to be?
I would kind of lean towards most of the distribution will be on the third or fourth answer, you know, the 1 to 2 or 2+ years. And that if you're not already on cloud, you're not already talked about the journey, that means you might be in the budget time of year to start developing that budget for next year, starting to roadmap that out. I'm sure, you know, we haven't talked about COVID yet in this presentation, but that obviously adds another layer to all of this.
Absolutely. We'll be talking about COVID later when I focus on fraud statistics and the fact that fraud has increased 1,000% during COVID, which is just crazy to think about.
We're going to go ahead and close this out here. And it looks like you were correct, Logan.
You are correct. So, whoops. And it disappeared. That sounds good. So it looks like folks are in a variety of different places with respect to an ERP cloud migration. Most it looks like half, more than half, are 1+ years out. And about 30% are in process of an Oracle cloud migration right now. Fantastic. Well, as you know, as we can see, not everyone is in the same place with respect to a cloud migration, but it's good to be thinking about a variety of factors, either if you're already in the process or as you move forward. Things like connectivity. How many banks are you using? How many of those banks are you looking just to get cash positioning from? How many are you looking to get payment? Are you looking to do payments with? Are those payments high or low value? Are they domestic? Are they international? Is it time to rationalize your banks? Things to think about from a connectivity perspective. From a bank monitoring perspective, historically, most of your bank monitoring is probably happening with your IT teams internally. What Kyriba brings to the table is that we allow you to really outsource that activity and eliminate the need for your IT teams to focus on connectivity or even to focus on maintaining that connectivity. Internationally, banks typically change their formats about every 2 years. And so there's always something that's going on in terms of needing to be adjusted and going through the testing and so forth, and the testing process that Logan alluded to earlier. There's also the payment format library, and Logan didn't steal my thunder, but we have 45,000 pre-developed and bank tested payment formats that are off the shelf and ready to use. And this is really our unique value proposition at Kyriba. We started out as a SaaS solution. We were providing connectivity to our clients over the last 20 years. We're a multi-tenant environment, and so all of our clients get to share that bank connectivity information, which is truly unique in the industry. And while it normally takes folks if you work with a Lear, it'll probably take 3 to 6 months to set up. Historically, it would have taken 3 to 6 months to set up a bank connection for each format. For us at Kyriba, it takes about 12 hours. So a significant difference in what is happening today. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about fraud detection, real-time fraud detection, and some of the things that are happening in the industry. As I mentioned during the poll, with COVID, fraud is up more than 1,000%, which is pretty significant. So if we start out talking about connectivity as a service, it will probably be interesting for you to note that Kyriba runs the world's largest bank connectivity as a service. And we do that, we have, as of last week, we had 1,096 active configured and tested bank connections. We also run 20% of Swift's corporate business through Kyriba. We're monitoring all of the bank connectivity 7/24. We have a team of folks that is focusing on that. So in the event something happens with a bank connection overnight, for example, or in another part of the world, that is reconnected and ready to go for you when you come in the morning. I mentioned already that it's an average of 12 hours for us to do the connectivity versus 500 hours on average for an ERP traditional systems integrator to come in and do that. We also are a fully outsourced connectivity service. We don't require any IT resources from you. Once we get it set up, we also don't require any ongoing resources as well. One of our recent clients had 4 different folks that were managing their Swift AL2 connection and trying to maintain their bank connectivity. So they had 4 folks focused on this. They implemented us. They went with a Swift Service Bureau white glove service, so they didn't have to have any folks from their side involved. And so the CIO was excited because his team wasn't being drawn into some of these frustrating bank connectivity issues. And the treasurer loved it because they were able to add some banks and make some bank changes much more quickly than they had ever been able to do in the past. So when we start out our conversations working with new clients, we always start with bank connectivity. How many banks do you have? We start to take a look at rationalization. And earlier this week, I met with another company who had 12 international banks. We went through the analysis and we were direct connected to 11 of them. The 12th one, we actually went back with, or I went back with 2 recommendations. I went back with a recommendation where we use Swift if they wanted to do bank payments out of that particular bank. And we also went back with a recommendation that they could switch to a different bank, which would allow them, who was also direct connected, allowing them to eliminate the cost of Swift since we could do everything else from a direct connection perspective. So we really at Kyriba view ourselves as kind of consultants in terms of helping you as you go through your rationalization process to be able to come up with the best bank connectivity at the lowest cost to you. There are a number of different connection methods that we can use. Logan already talked about Swift. We do offer Swift as a white glove service or Swift as AL2. We resell the AL2 service through Swift. We also do a number of direct-to-bank, host-to-host connections, whether it be through APIs or through SFTP. We also offer connections to regional networks. So countries like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, the UK, they offer regional networks to support the connection between their countries' banking partners. So we connect to dozens of those, including Zengen, Anzer, Ebix, Bax, CBI, and Editran. So we have a number of ways to connect on the payment side. We also offer a service on the bank cash positioning side where Kyriba owns our own BIC, and it's a banking BIC, and it allows us to offer it to our clients to be able to be used to pull bank statements back. It's a much less expensive alternative than having your own BIC if there are just a few banks that you want to be able to pull your statement reporting from. Logan spent a lot of time talking about the frustrations with traditional ERP payment development. There are a lot of places where this process can go awry and it can take much longer than expected. Things like you have to work on the bank's timeline and the fact that they want to work with you during their daytime hours, and if they're in China, that's not really convenient for your folks to be able to work in those in that time zone. The average time it takes to develop the bank connection is 3 to 6 months, and that's for each format. And typically we see an average of 3 to 4 templates per bank. So it can become a quite lengthy project. We also have heard from numerous organizations that bank connectivity is often forgotten about in an Oracle Cloud migration. Like, it's the last thing folks think about. It's typically an IT initiated activity, and IT isn't thinking a whole lot about bank connections. So we'd encourage you to get involved early and remind folks that bank connectivity is really important, because we've seen that a lot of the tests fail the first time around. So this is traditional development. This is really what Kyriba does. We're able to take a single payment file that comes out of the ERP. It hits against our payment format library. Again, we have 45,000, more than 45,000 now, different formats that are available. We hit against that, and then we go and are able to send it to the bank based on whatever the most economical way of transferring it to the bank is. We're also able to take the information from the bank, feed it back through Kyriba and back into the ERP to allow you to be able to keep your ERP as a system of record. We've been developing this for 20 years. We have 7 full-time people that are focused on making sure that the file formats that we have are current and up to date. If a bank makes a change somewhere else in the world, we make the change within the format library. So one time we have to make the change, and it applies to all of our clients. So say, for example, we have just over 2,200 different clients that are using our connectivity. If, say, 500 of them are using the same bank, say Citibank, for example, we have one pipe that goes to Citibank with all of the various clients' information going through that pipe. We don't have to create 500 different connections with Citibank. So we don't require IT resources. It's a pretty straightforward process that we go through. We've been talking about some of the potential challenges with bank integrations. Now it's time to see what you think your biggest challenges are with bank integrations. Logan, what do you think this poll is going to look like?
I think it's always a mixed bag of flexibility and expertise.
Good answer. Yeah, there's a lot that can go wrong as part of the process, right? There are a lot of different pieces to the process.
And we'll give everyone another 30 seconds, then we're going to close it out.
Okay. We typically see that banks globally have a tendency to make a lot more format changes than we do here in the United States. So I think those companies that are mostly US or domestic banks don't experience as many problems as those that have a big global footprint. Is that what you see as well?
I would agree with that. You know, it always seems like the states are a little slow to engage some of the same standards or slow to adapt in some of the same ways. But I mean, it's not always best to be first, right?
Yeah.
Don't be last.
So true. Let's see, it looks like payment format testing is one of the biggest frustrations, and lack of flexibility to add new banks is the second one. Not really surprising at all in terms of the results. I'm going to move ahead now and just briefly focus on what we call the spaghetti diagram. So in terms of traditional having the connections built between your Oracle Cloud system and all of your banks, this diagram is pretty typical when I talk to most organizations. The color scheme's makes me a little sick here, but basically we're going from Oracle Cloud to each of the banks or non-banks that you have. If you think about an organization that might be working with 50 different banks, that's a lot of connections that have to be built. When you look at the Kyriba solution, what we do is we insert the hub in the middle of the process. So we're able to take, again, a single payment file that's coming out of the ERP, feed it through the hub, and then pass it out to the banks, again, taking the data that we get back from the banks and feeding it all the way back through to Oracle, for example. Inside the payment hub, we go through a number of different steps. So the payment control center does a lot in terms of the approvals. So in some cases, approvals are already being done in the source system, and they can continue to be done in the source system and then just pass through Kyriba. We often will see organizations who have multiple different ERP systems, whether it be Oracle, SAP, Lawson, Microsoft Dynamics, because they've grown a lot through acquisition. So they have all these different systems that are in place. They're operating in a number of different countries, and each country seems to have their own approval processes as well. And so they use Kyriba as the pipe to make sure that there's consistency across all of the payments, that they're being looked at and approved appropriately for the entire organization, which then eliminates some of the potential problems that can arise when you don't have that. So you have the opportunity to use payment controls or not. Each of these blocks within the middle of the Kyriba circle is independent or can be looked at independently. The format transformation is the reason that most folks come to us, right? Because we have the formats already created, tested, developed. We still go through a penny test to make sure that your connection is actually in place and we're getting, you know, everything is set up appropriately for you, which is why it takes us the 12 hours. Is to really make sure it's appropriate. And then we go through the bank connectivity. We're talking with you through the entire time about the best way to connect to your banks. And then as you're making changes over time, it's really easy to make those changes because we already have those folks in the library. If, in fact, we don't have your bank in the library, we actually add that bank at no cost to you. Because if you're using that bank, we feel that someone else will be using that bank as well. So let's add them to the format library and make sure that they get in there. So earlier this year, we were at about 1,000 banks. Now we're at 1,096 banks. So we continue to add those 96 banks, and we didn't charge our customers at all for those. The final box here is fraud detection, and Kyriba does a number of things in terms of fraud detection, and I'm going to focus on that in the next slide, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Logan, is there anything else that you think I should have mentioned here on this slide?
No, yeah, I think probably one of the biggest call outs that you made there along the way was that, you know, if in fact you are a client that is banking maybe with an obscure financial institution, maybe a smaller credit union, for example, that if it comes to fruition and we find out that Kyriba doesn't have any active clients or active connection with that, the fact that Kyriba product development team will actually take on that effort for free is something that's very much worth pointing out. Is that I've only come across it really a handful of times where the client side bank list had one that maybe fell out during validation, but standing up a new connection, going through all those items and having Kyriba support that body of work or that effort is a very straightforward process. So I'm glad you called that out.
Great. Thanks, Logan. So AFP went through a fraud survey in 2019, and what they found is that 88% of the companies who were surveyed indicated they'd either experienced fraud or experienced attempted fraud in the last year. That's a pretty high number. Really means more like when you're going to get hit by fraud, not if you're going to get hit by fraud, right? I mean, fraud's going to happen. And with 88% of companies saying, yep, it's already happened to them, it's just a matter of time. What they also shared was more than $100,000 median loss, $114,000 median loss per payment fraud. And in 22% of the cases, it was more than $1 million that was lost in fraud. So the question is, what are you doing from a fraud perspective? And that takes us right into poll question number 3. This is the last poll question. So just so everyone's aware, this is the last one you'll have to answer. But it's really trying to understand how you're managing fraud today and what your focus is on fraud. Jordan's put up the poll question. She'll give you a little bit of time to answer. Logan, what have you seen with respect to payment fraud?
I think for the most part, most of our clients are reactive and not so much proactive in the space, right? They only find out after it's happened, and then it's time to react to it, especially the clients that are maybe stateside that still use checks as a very valid and very widely used payment method. That's definitely come about. It's also a little bit easier to commit, check fraud than it is to do it electronically with payments, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, you're right.
So then you're really just kind of left to the banks because there aren't too many solutions. I know you'll talk about Kyribas, but not too many solutions that can be, proactive in evaluating the nature of a payment and whether it falls out of line with, your typical payment transaction lifecycle.
Yeah, so true. Jordan, how are we doing on the results?
We are going to go ahead and close them out here.
All right, so relying on banks for payment fraud and investigating solutions are actually tied. And then a couple, it looks like 14% of folks say no concern about payment fraud. So, okay, sounds good. Well, payment fraud is one of those things that it's good to be researching what some of your what some of the things that are available to you in the marketplace. Bad actors have always tried to maliciously obtain personal data and then commit acts like payment fraud against organizations. COVID-19 and the new working environment, folks all being at home, not having the opportunity to talk to somebody over the wall or down the hallway, are producing the perfect storm for these folks to be able to increase their number of attempts and then actually perfect their approach to obtain information via fraudulent actions. So I'm not going to go through all of these as I'm talking. I'm sure you're reading them, but you can see here that losses due to fraud are increasing and organizations need to be vigilant to be able to prevent fraud. There's a lot happening out there. And I've even heard one of our clients was talking about for the CFO and having their voice recorded during one of the analyst annual meetings. That voice was then chopped up and created a request for somebody to do a payment transfer that came directly, it sounded like it came directly from the CFO. This individual did the transfer, and it wasn't until after the transfer had gone that they recognized that this was a fraudulent request. So it's crazy what folks are doing in this day and age to make to make money, I guess. Kyriba really focuses on fraud prevention. We have two different approaches. We have a rules-based approach and we have a machine learning approach. I should tell you that rapid deployment, everything you're going to hear here is about Kyriba trying to help you get to market faster, right? It takes us days or weeks to get our fraud detection put in place, not months to get fraud detection put in place. And we know that that's important because especially in this day and age, fraud is significantly increasing. When we think about detection rules, we think about those things that you're looking to prevent from happening. For example, when we have a brand new vendor that comes in, we probably should validate to see whether or not the account details are correct. When we have a change in vendor information, someone has changed the account number at a particular bank, for example, we probably again should stop that payment briefly to confirm that it in fact is a new account and not somebody that's made some alterations internally to have the money put in their account instead. We also have rules like, are we sending payments to countries we're doing business in? Out in Washington State, they had a number of situations where unemployment checks ended up going to someplace in, I think it was Nigeria. And again, our system could have stopped that if they were using it, because we would have said unemployment checks in Washington State should probably be going to people in Washington State, not to Nigeria, for example. So we have a number of rules that are, you're able to define what you want those rules to be. We have a number of common rules, but then we also create them for whatever you need. The second thing that we do that I always get most excited about is we're using machine learning. And this is using algorithms to detect unusual behaviors. So we can load in your history, payment history, or you can allow your payment history to build. And then it will look for things like, you've been paying a vendor $100,000 a month for the last 18 months. Now you have an invoice for $500,000. This seems unusual. In the way that this day and age where things are moving so quickly, someone may not know, even identify that that's five times what you normally pay, but the system will flag it for you, and it might be legitimate. You may have significantly increased the amount of business that you're doing with this vendor, but it's worth having someone look at. And we have a color-coded system that allows you to actually see, is this a big, do we think this is a big risk, a little risk, where does this fit in the riskiness, and then allows folks to go in and take action from that. Finally, we also offer sanction screening, which everyone is getting done at the banks, right? The banks have to do sanction screening. And what we have 30 lists, global lists that are available. But once it gets to the bank and it's identified, then you have a lot of other issues, because the bank has to notify the government that you were trying to send a payment to someone that was on a list where you shouldn't be sending that payment to. If you back sanction screening up internally, then you identify those risks internally and it never even makes it to the bank. So we have some ability to do some things for you there. I wanted to share with you, one of our recent customers is TransUnion, and I can tell you about their situation because this is actually, if you look them up online, this is public information. So TransUnion lost $17 million to fraud in 8 days. There was an email that went to one of their directors in Asia that looked like it came from the CFO, asking them to make a series of payments over this 8-day time frame. The only reason that they stopped making payments was because they ran out of money. That director called the CFO directly and said, I have your most recent request, but there's no more money in the account. Where do you want me to pull this money from? And it was at that point that the CFO said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And the director in Asia said, oh my gosh, $17 million have walked out the door. This is a big problem, big enough that the CEO had to report it on their earnings statement, and they're now being scrutinized a lot more heavily. The treasurer told us that the only reason he didn't lose his job was because 2 years ago, he had recommended Kyriba, and specifically fraud detection, and the CFO said that the $200,000 that it would have cost to put it in wasn't worth the money. So for $200,000, he could have prevented the specific issue, because when you look at some of our sample detection rules, 4 of these detection rules would have raised flags to stop any of those $17 million payments from going out the door. The problem was that they weren't validating any new accounts. they bypassed all of the approval systems that they should have had in place because the director thought something coming to that from the CFO was something that he could just act on. And there were some very unique connectivity points that were taking place. And so we had more of that. Anyone can get hit by fraud, and you need to be looking for solutions that are going to tell you real time, this is something that you shouldn't send out the door. There are a number of solutions out there that will tell you it was fraudulent after you've already initiated the payment. So make sure you're asking the question, when are they actually looking at the payment information that goes out the door? Logan, I'm going to jump to a traditional customer profile now, but before I go on, is there anything else that I should have mentioned with respect to fraud?
No, I think you kind of hit on it. The only thing that I'll maybe allude to is that, when you talk about the cost to implement it, it's, when she says something like $200,000, that might be the cost for the software for over a few years, might include some implementation costs. But one of the things I talk about is how easy it is to actually implement. We in general talk about Kyriba being a highly configurable application across the entire application and all of its modules and submodules. But when it comes to fraud, the logic behind it is a whole lot of checkboxes and drop downs is what it amounts to, right? So it's when you're going through the design of this, it's a very easy lift. And once clients start to get on board with it and start to have some buy-in, it usually is a pretty straightforward experience for us from an implementation standpoint. And as Kirsten's called out, it tends to pay for itself very quickly too.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when fraud is more than $100,000 per situation, it can happen quickly. Or in TransUnion's case, they lost money and they ended up implementing fraud. So the typical customer profile, as we look at organizations that are coming to us for help with their bank connectivity and payments, is that normally they have a global banking footprint, right? They're not just doing banks in the United States. It's a lot easier to do connections with banks in the United States than it is elsewhere in the world. In addition, they typically have multiple ERPs. It might be that they have multiple instances of Oracle. It might be that they've grown through acquisition. I'm working with an organization right now that has what they would say 100 different source systems, which is a lot, but they've always grown through acquisition, and they've never required that the companies that they've acquired move to the same platform. And so it's very, very complicated. And for them, trying to get overall visibility of what's happening with payments when they have these 100 different systems has been a little bit overwhelming. And they were very excited when I put the spaghetti diagram that I shared with you up earlier and talked to them. The woman said, "That's it. No one else has been able to tell me that they understand what our real problem is." And so the multiple ERPs is one that's very common for our customers. The tight timeline for connectivity, most folks, for example, I'm working with a company right now. They're going live with their Oracle cloud migration in April, and they haven't even started. We had conversations with them last week, and that was the first time they'd started looking at connectivity. They have, I think, 36 different banks that they need to get up and running between now and when they go live in April. Again, a tight timeline. Logan?
I was just going to say good luck with that.
It will be tight, even for us, Logan. Even for us. So typically folks are wanting to reduce their reliance on IT. And right now, IT, you need resources if you're going to make bank account changes, once you get set up. And so there's a desire to reduce that reliance there. And then the flexibility to add new banks or to change relationships when it doesn't make sense anymore. And then all of our clients do have a concern about payment fraud. Some of them are actually taking action, and others are contemplating whether or not they want to take action, to what degree. So Kyriba, you know, this all comes down to, do you want to build it unique to you, or would you like to buy a product that's off the shelf? And so from a qualitative perspective, we have clients that are looking at us because we're reducing their costs and we're providing some predictability in terms of what their future outlook is. We have bank grade security. We have clients like Lockheed Martin and Boeing. We have gone through extensive security assessments. We have no concerns with whatever the security questions that you're going to have. We don't allow anyone access outside of Kyriba to our format library. So it's something that we control, we maintain. It's part of our product. It is part of our service level agreement because it is a part of our product. They're also excited about having things like fraud detection available to them. Amway came to us. They had over 100 banks with different technologies. They had a variety of different controls and approval processes that were in place. They implemented Kyriba. They were able to reduce their bank footprint by 50%. They were able to consolidate into 4 regional shared service centers. They saved more than 600 hours per month. And they boosted morale because now they were able to allow their folks to be more strategic and spend less time trying to gather information and manually enter information off of spreadsheets and upload that into the bank portals and have opportunities for lots of errors. So from a qualitative perspective, there are some other benefits in terms of not just what you see up on the screen. From a quantitative perspective, we typically save clients between 70 and 80% in terms of both cost and time. So you can get set up much more quickly. We have an actual customer's information that I didn't build the slide on, but I can share with you. They looked at a 5-year total cost of ownership. They had 50 banks that they were dealing with that were global. The cost to build, working with their systems integrator and building each one of those connections to the bank, was $4.5 million. And it would take them to get their 50 banks up and running about 4.6 years. They came to Kyriba. They actually are now a Kyriba customer, by the way. The cost for 5 years of Kyriba over time was $1.5 million, and it took us 1 year to get all 50 of their banks up and running. So they were able to save $3 million and reduce their bank, having all of their banks up and running from 4.6 down to 1 year. So to summarize, 93% of CIOs say that bank connectivity is one of the most complicated aspects of an ERP project. Kyriba runs the largest connectivity hub in the world, and we're unique because we have 45,000 bank file formats that are already available, tested, on the shelf, ready for you to use. We also offer solutions in terms of real-time fraud detection, and we can provide you a lot more for a lot less. So Logan, before we go to questions, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think the kind of final driving factor you touched on last slide a little bit about the time differences between doing the integration work in Oracle and what you can deliver from connectivity as a service. And the fact that it takes us a few days now with Kyriba versus a month at a time to do all this work, and the difference between those time dimensions of those factors has really been a game changer for the number of the clients that have chose to do it. I mean, I can't imagine spending 4 years going through bank integration. It's a brutally painful exercise.
It is a brutally painful exercise, for sure, for sure. So Jordan, do we have any questions that have come in the chat?
Yeah, so we have a couple here. We are towards the end of our time, but let's try to get through one or two quick. So I know you mentioned a few different examples, but how long does a average or typical ERP connectivity project take?
So that's a really great question, Jordan. The length of the project is really dependent on the complexity of the banking environment. It can take, from a bank connectivity standpoint, it can take a couple of weeks on the short end. It can also take up to a year. I talked about our total cost of ownership. They had 50 banks, and we were able to get all 50 banks up and running in a year. So it's dependent on how complicated, but I'm happy to talk to whomever asked that question. My contact details are on the slide. Feel free to reach out to me and I can give you a better estimate of what that would take.
Excellent. And one more quick, outside of connectivity, what about other treasury functionality? Can that be added as well?
Absolutely. So Kyriba is a modular solution, and we're running off the same platform, and you pick and choose which modules make most sense for you. So it's and Logan might be able to speak to it more from an implementation perspective, but my understanding, very straightforward. Whether you need debt or investments, cash positioning, forecasting, payments, fraud, whatever it is you're looking for, we're able to provide that.
Yeah, I think the only thing to add on to that is that if you're only looking for connectivity, that's all you can technically get if you want to from a Kyriba perspective. And the fact that connectivity is technically standalone and how the payment hub works within Kyriba is technically standalone and wholly separate from the treasury workstation of Kyriba that we all know and love, where all the debt investment and true cash management modules all live within.
Great.
And with that, we are going to wrap up our session today. We do still have 2 additional sessions this afternoon. The next up at 1 p.m. is building a digital treasury strategy with our Treasury Advisory Services lead, Edmund Glasnap. We do also have a demo of Oracle Cloud Cash Management this afternoon as well. Thank you so much to Kirsten and the Kyriba team for their work on this session, and everyone have a great rest of their day.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, guys.